So we have this beautiful equation. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Y is GDP. It's income. Why don't we use I for income? Because I is investment. So I is investment, Y is income. And don't ask me why. It just is. Okay? So if you go back here, the total of this is consumption and investment. Yes? Government spending and exports. So GDP, there are 4 things that go into the businesses. Do we see that? Down here we have the businesses. Businesses right here. What goes into them? Consumption goes into them. Investment goes into them. Government purchases go into them. And exports go into them. What goes out is imports, so we have to subtract out the fact that imports are leaving. But the 4 things that go into the businesses, plus the fact that the import spending is going to businesses that are outside of our country, so that's a negative, that's what GDP is. Consumption, investment, government purchases, exports, minus the imports. Okay? So we can write that out as an equation. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. That's GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, which is this: consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus exports minus imports. So it's an equation that Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay? Fun? It's fun, yes? It's fun? Okay. It turns out that you can also do it upside down. So GDP is also consumption plus savings, which balances against investment, and taxes, which balances against government. So we don't usually do this so much. We sort of do it because it affects other things that we're going to measure. But GDP is also consumption plus savings plus taxes, which again, taxes, savings correlates to investment, taxes correlates to government activity, right? And we already took out the imports and exports both in that. So C plus S plus T is the mirror of C plus I plus G plus NX. Is that exciting? It's exciting. I know. You're very excited now. So what are the bad parts of GDP? What are the bad things about GDP? Well, we already sort of talked about some of these. One is this idea of household production. If I do my dishes and you do your dishes, that's not part of GDP. If I pay you to do my dishes and you pay me to do your dishes, now we're part of GDP. All this work that we do at home, you know, fixing things up and doing our laundry and doing our dishes and all that, if we got paid for it, it'd be part of GDP. We don't count it at GDP because we don't get paid for it, but okay? People have vegetable gardens in their backyard. They're growing food. You have mango trees in Hawaii in your backyard growing food. If you sold it, it would count in GDP. If you eat it, it doesn't. Why? Okay? There is one part of this that we do actually count, and that's food grown by farmers for their own use. So if you think about the United States in, 1776, or you think about a lot of little countries in the world today that are still primarily agricultural countries, what do you know? Well, what you know is that lots of people who live on farms are growing most of their own food. So if we go back to the U.S. in 1776, food grown by people for their own consumption is a huge part of the economy, right? Most people were farmers, and most people fed themselves back then. They might have traded or bought a little bit of stuff, but they took care of themselves. So that was a huge part of GDP. In the modern world, it's a much smaller part of GDP in the United States, but we still count it. So the government still tries to estimate food production, people on farmers, not you and me, but farmers who grow food for themselves, the government still tries to add that into GDP, right? And again, this whole thing of if we don't pay each other, it's not in GDP. If we do, I pay you, you pay me, we go into GDP. Yeah. Right? If you and your classmates take notes, it's not in GDP. If I pay you for your notes and you pay me for my notes, now we're in GDP. Okay? Don't pay anybody for notes. Whatever we are up to here, what's called the underground economy. So the underground economy is the part of the economy that the government who's trying to calculate this all doesn't see. Okay? So I don't know if you've ever worked as a food server or in the food industry, but most of the money that people make in the food industry is cash. And I didn't put one of these pictures up here because, I don't want people to complain but go look at the pool parties that happen at the hotels at Las Vegas, the day clubs. Okay? The servers, the cocktail servers at those places work 6 months a year and can make six figures. Okay? And I guarantee you that they're not reporting all the money that they make. I guarantee you that rich guys are throwing $100 bills at their servers just to show off or because, well, you know how guys are. But those servers are not reporting that. If you go to the casino part of a hotel, you will notice that when a tip is made, when a player makes a tip, the dealer who gets the tip takes that tip, taps it on the table so that the eye in the sky and the floor man can see it, and then they put it in a box. And the tips are pooled. Okay? The IRS came into Las Vegas, actually sent spies into Las Vegas who got hired at the casinos to track tips. And basically started to audit everybody who worked in a casino. Okay? People who were making $100,000 a year were reporting $10,000 on their income tax. There were people who were reporting $10,000 a year on their income tax and living in $500,000 houses. And they'd gotten a loan for that house. Okay? So in an agreement with the IRS, the casinos basically pool everybody's tips. So all the tips get put into a bundle and then get split up to the employees and get paid to their employees as part of their paychecks. And that way the IRS gets its share of all those taxes. But lots of people operate in ways that they avoid taxes. They get paid in cash. It's not uncommon for small businesses to have two cash registers, and one cash register is a cash-only cash register, and what goes in there never gets reported to the IRS. Okay? As we get more technological in all these things, it happens less, but happens. Okay? So the IRS doesn't know about that stuff. There's all this underground activity. Right? And again, if you know Vegas at all, you know that there's tens of thousands of people out there who are simply underreporting their income by a lot, some of them. Okay? Number two, illegal activities. The drug dealer that's selling opioids and creating an epidemic for us is not reporting their income. So illegal activity is part of this underground economy. We don't know about it. And then three, sometimes people want to avoid the rules. So construction companies will sometimes hire people for cash for day work, and they do that because they don't want to have to follow the rules. So there might be an agreement that they have to pay a certain wage. They don't want to pay all their workers that wage, so they bring in some day workers who are working for less than what the contract says they're supposed to work for, or the business is bending the safety rules or the immigration rules or whatever rules they're bending, and they just make sure that nobody sees it, and so the government can't see it to put it into GDP. Okay? The richer the country is, generally, the less underground economy there is. And when we talk about less developed countries, poorer countries, most of what happens in that country, or much of what happens in that country, might be underground. The government's less likely to know about things that happen. And when the government doesn't know about it, it can't put it into GDP. Okay? Hopefully that all just made sense, what I say. All right? So we'd like to use GDP to compare country to country. And in fact, we're going to do that here. But it's wrong. You should never do what we're going to do, which is to use GDP to compare one country to another. Because the size of the underground economy and other things about GDP differ from country to country. And so if we say, hey, the United States GDP is four times India, prove it. Okay? GDP, like all statistics, is subject to the variation of the data collection. And so to compare, GDP in one country to another is questionable at best. We're still going to do it. So how about GDP and our well-being, our happiness? Well, if you are richer now, you're making more money, and you work a little less because of that, you take time off and you're partying more, GDP goes down. You're happier, but GDP went down. Right? If you retire early and you stop making whatever you were making, so you had a company, you were producing stuff, you stop it, you made a lot of money, you stop producing, and now you just party on the money you already have, GDP goes down. Okay? So we can make the people in our country happier, give us greater well-being, while GDP is going down. GDP doesn't necessarily correlate with how happy we are. Okay? As GDP rises in a country, we get pollution and we get congestion, we get all this negative stuff. Look at pictures of Beijing from 15, 20 years ago, where the air was clean and everybody was riding bicycles around. Now you look at pictures of Beijing, the pollution's terrible. If you were around during the Olympics, when the Olympics were in Beijing, they actually banned cars for the Olympics for 3 days before the Olympics because they were afraid the runners were going to drop over dead from the smog. There's huge, horrible traffic congestion now in Beijing. They have a 50-lane highway. Yes, a 50-lane highway, and it gets congested, and it can take hours to drive in and out of Beijing on this 50-lane highway. So all of these negative things that get created by producing more not only don't count against GDP, but cleaning them up adds to GDP. So producing creates pollution, and then we spend money to clean up the pollution, which makes GDP bigger. Pollution should make GDP, in a sense, smaller because it's a negative aspect of production, but in fact it doesn't work that way. The things we do to clean up pollution actually make GDP bigger. Yes? Yeah. Okay, you're not that excited. As GDP grows and as your economy grows over time, you get more social problems, you get advanced economies, right? There isn't an opioid epidemic in a rural farm country, right? We have them in developed countries. We have social problems that develop in countries that are richer and have more money and do more stuff, okay? And that's not part of GDP. And then, lastly, and one of the most important things that we talk about all the time these days, is the GDP is about how much we produce, not how income is distributed. So you could have two countries that have identical GDPs, and in one country, one person has 90% of the money and the whole rest of the country is splitting up 10%. And in the other country, it's pretty even. And the income is spread out pretty even among everybody. Well, you might rather live in the country where income is spread out, unless you're the one guy with all the money. You'd probably rather live in the country where everything's spread out pretty even. But GDP doesn't tell us anything about that. Okay? We have oil-producing countries that have pretty high GDPs and real high GDPs per person, and we're going to talk about GDP per person here in a minute. So they have this high level of, right, on average, the average person in, Qatar makes more money than the average person in the United States. Except, really, you have a small group of very rich people and then a large group of not so rich people. And the income distribution is more uneven in those countries than in the United States. And the income distribution in European countries is more even than it is in the United States. So you have this range of different levels of income distribution or income inequality. And GDP doesn't care about any of that, right? So GDP is not about whether the spread of income is close or far apart or nice or bad or whatever word you want to use. It's only about how much stuff we have. It's not about who's getting all that stuff.